Hi, and welcome to the Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. In the 20th century, or the late 20th century, I should say, we thought we understood treason. We thought it was people from the left who worked for foreign dictators. Even now, ITV is still making dramas about Philby, Burgess and McLean, the public school boys who betrayed their country to Moscow, to the Soviet Union. They're still remembered. People who come from my corner of the left, a rather small corner, I'm afraid to say, uh, were defined by our opposition to people like George Galloway, who led the anti-Iraq war movement at the same time, even though he had saluted Saddam Hussein, a clearly fascist leader who had engaged in genocide of ethnic minorities. We deplored Jeremy Corbyn, another left-wing leader, because he said he was a leftist, he said he was a socialist, but then he went off and worked for the propaganda station of Iran, a theocracy that is misogynist, homophobic, all the rest of it. You know the score. But these are familiar arguments. We're now in a very unfamiliar world. There is a dictator in Moscow, but he doesn't call himself a communist. He's not Stalin, he's Putin. And the people who work for him, overwhelmingly, whether it's Tucker Carlson and supporters of Carlson and Vance in the US, supporters of Marine Le Pen in France, Orban and his corrupt clique in Hungary, are from the radical right. We now have a radical right movement that in the classic sense is betraying its country to its country's enemies. And this is not me being a hyperbolic journalist, it's me dealing with what is in front of our eyes. On 21 November, the 21st November, which I guess will be after most of you have heard this podcast, maybe some people will be listening in the archives, but on the 21st November, the Old Bailey will sentence one Nathan Gill. He was Farage's man in Wales, as we shall see. He was a big figure, important guy to Farage. Reform UKIP was very strong in Wales. Reform is very strong in Wales, and he faces 8 charges of bribery, to which he's pleaded guilty, incidentally, that he was paid by pro-Kremlin politicians to essentially issue anti-Ukrainian propaganda in the European Parliament. This is something new, or something. Actually, you go back to the 30s when there were assorted Mitford sisters going off with the Nazis. It's kind of like that again. We're having right-wing treason in Britain. To talk about this, I am delighted to be joined by, I guess I have to call him now, the Lowdown's grey area correspondent, Arthur Snell, the Lowdown's dark arts correspondent. Arthur, I'm sure you do know, but if you don't know him, he's a former Foreign Office diplomat. His lovely employers sent him to all the trouble spots everywhere in the world where there's trouble: Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan. You get the picture. Arthur knows about the grey area, as I said, where diplomacy meets covert warfare, meets espionage. Arthur, hi, thank you so much for coming on.
Nick, thank you for having me.
It's a real pleasure having you again. You're becoming a regular feature as our correspondent. Do you agree with my analysis that we are seeing something new, or something we haven't really seen since the 1930s?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the features of this is this weird approach to what we might, in using fairly sort of simple language, call patriotism, in the sense that almost anyone in Britain doesn't have to think very hard to see Russia as a threat to our country. And in fact, you know, for example, when you travel around the English countryside, I always get heartened by seeing Ukraine flags sort of, you know, on village churches and just dotted around. It shows that ordinary people in this country understand what's at stake in Russia and Ukraine. And yet, for a portion of the radical right, the idea somehow that Russia's a threat to us and that we are somehow in some kind of existential struggle with a really toxic and poisonous autocracy is something that they reject. So it's very strange, this sort of rejection of what should be a fairly simple patriotic value, that people who wish us harm are a threat to our country.
People who have done us harm, incidentally, people who
Indeed.
have poisoned British citizens with
Yeah.
chemical weapons, frankly,
Yeah.
on the streets of British towns and British cities. And that's incidentally what did for Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
As soon as Corbyn stands up in the Commons and starts to doubt it, pretending it's some kind of, I don't know, Chomsky false flag operation, and he's off into conspiracy theory, he's finished. It's over,
Yeah.
including with a lot of people on the left, incidentally, I was heartened to see as well.
Yeah, and that shouldn't be surprising because after all, only a very cynical sort of right-wing media apparatchik would claim that people on the left lack patriotism. I mean, there may be a different approach to certain, institutions. There may be a different attitude to British colonialism and all the rest of it. But the idea that only people on the right love their country is clearly completely nonsensical. Now, what's interesting is the way that the radical right in the US and here has managed to get away with this, that they're not
Yeah.
seen. I think lots of people who have a relatively neutral opinion of Nigel Farage don't think of him as a traitor. They certainly don't think of him as someone who's aligned himself with some of our enemies. And yes, this fascinating and important story about Nathan Gill, which I know we're going to talk about a bit more, doesn't appear to have really cut through in a sort of national level as an illustration, perhaps, of where where these sort of divided loyalties seem to lie on that right.
Well, let's see if in our own small way, Arthur, we can change that and get a bit of cut through going. I think it might help actually. It's quite interesting to just talk about, give you some picture of who Nathan Gill is, and then I'll bring then you can come back in
Sure.
on the geopolitics and the ideological politics. He's in his early 50s. His family, he set up business with his mother. Even though he's from Wales and his family, and he lives in Wales now, he's settled on Anglesey. His family's from Anglesey. He and his mother set up a business that was a kind of cleaning and care business, whose sole buyer was Kingston on Hull Council. So he was providing a lot of services for them. Inevitably, Arthur, absolutely inevitably, the workers he got in were migrants, Polish and Filipino migrants, and he put them up in bunkhouses, charged them for the privilege, of course, and loads of people, when he goes on into Farage's politics, accuse him of being a hypocrite, like so many people in business who are right-wing who then use migrant labour at the same time as denouncing migrants. I'll just leave that one hanging in the air. What's significant for what comes next is he's got his business with his mother, one customer, always a dangerous situation to be in. If you're a businessman with only one, or businesswoman with only one customer, or if you if you're a worker, only one employer will ever employ you, you're very, very at risk. In the crash of 2008, the business goes bust. And he retires to Anglesey. He's a Mormon. He's with his wife. They've got 5 kids, which don't come cheap. As all parents listening to this podcast will know. So he makes a career in politics, like a lot of people who fail in business. I don't want to get into some kind of grand sociological theory, but it is true that radical right parties have always done well among middle class people who feel that the big powers have somehow done for their business. The government, the EU, big business. I was a plucky little entrepreneur. I was a small guy. I was dumbed down. I will get my vengeance. The radical right has always profited from people like that. And Snell, I'm sorry, not Snell. You are that. You are at all. Gill, for God's sake, Karen, get it right.
Wasn't me, Gov.
Nathan Gill starts to move up in the hierarchy in Wales. And although Farage is trying to disassociate him from Gill now, he's Farage's man in Wales. Farage has an enemy in the Welsh, it was UKIP then, Neil Hamilton, another politician, incidentally, who was exposed as taking cash for questions by The Guardian back in the day. It all fits together, Arthur. You can see all these links coming in. You're dealing with a real pro here. By The Guardian, one of The Guardian's great scoops after Alan Rusbridger became editor. And Farage uses Nathan Gill to oppose Neil Hamilton. He loses that battle. Farage washes his hands of UKIP, says he doesn't want it anymore, sets up reform, and Nathan Gill is rewarded with a winnable seat on the list for the European Parliament. For a guy whose business has gone bust, that's a really nice sinecure. In today's money, the salary is 110 grand, not bad at all. Plus expenses, plus pension, plus all the bells and whistles. So Nathan Gill seems to be made, except he's got one tiny problem. Because of Farage, because of Farage and Johnson and Gove and all the other charlatans, we're actually leaving the EU. So he's elected in May 2019, and the British MEPs are withdrawn from the European Parliament at the end of January 2020 when we leave the EU. So he's only got about 6 months from the time he arrives to draw his salary, and then he's out again. So you can see we're going to get to the ideology, but you can see there's financial temptations there for someone who likes money. But Arthur, can you perhaps take us through a bit? I've laid out the sort of family background, the sociological background, financial background. He then gets caught up with this guy Voloshin. What do we know about what his dealings with Voloshin, about what happened?
Yeah. So Oleg Voloshin is a really key part of this story. He is one of these Ukrainians who was always on the side of Vladimir Putin. And of course, prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they were running a full-scale hybrid war in Ukraine where they were trying to sort of bring about the collapse of Ukrainian politics from the inside, but effectively by bankrolling pro-Russian, pro-Moscow politicians. And of course, as many listeners will know, Ukraine has a big Russian-speaking minority, many of whom completely reject Moscow, but it's a fertile ground in which at that time Moscow felt they could try to control Ukraine through sort of political means rather than what they're trying to do militarily. So Voloshin was very close to another better known Ukrainian, again on the sort of Moscow payroll, a guy called Viktor Medvedchuk. To get a sense of the significance of these people, by the time of Russia's invasion being imminent, Western intelligence services believed it was perfectly possible that one of those two, Voloshin or Medvedchuk, might actually be selected as the new ruler of Ukraine under a kind of Russian puppet government. Of course, that never came to pass, thanks to the bravery of Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. You know, they're still fighting for their freedom. But that just gives you a sense of who these people are, the significance they hold to the Kremlin. But we now need to go back in time. So as you've sort of set up the story, Nick, Nathan Gill, having had a few failed businesses behind him, is in Brussels, probably enjoying the kind of MEP lifestyle, and he then gets approached by Oleg Voloshin, who has been described by the US government as a pawn of Russian secret services, and effectively he starts to deliver speeches both in the parliament and on TV channels, which are giving a pro-Russian narrative. For example, he sort of starts saying that the Ukrainian state is mistreating the Russian minority and mistreating media channels in Ukraine that effectively were a mouthpiece for that. Again, these were some of the channels referred to were ones that were probably owned by this other guy, Medvedchuk. So we can see here that what you've got is a network of Putin's people, Putin's influencers, using effectively a probably rather stupid and certainly financially desperate British politician who was willing to take this money. He gave various speeches. He attended various events and so on. But then he had a stroke of bad luck, which was that the FBI arrested Voloshin. And at the time, this was in connection with effectively sanctions that the US government under the Biden administration were trying to put on those kind of pro-Putin politicians. And that began a long process, which led eventually to an investigation of Nathan Gill. Now, I say it began a long process because I think one of the parts of this story is the fact that the British law enforcement is usually hopeless at pursuing this kind of stuff. They hate anything to do with politicians breaking the law. And particularly, I think that there's a huge fear of tackling those on the radical right, and because they're extremely good at sort of manipulating the media on a kind of victimhood basis. So I think one of the reasons that we've seen this case come to the point that it has, and a sentencing imminent in the Old Bailey, is the fact that quite a lot of the investigating was initially done outside the UK and probably in ways that the British police couldn't ignore.
Right. We'll come back to that in a minute, Arthur, but I think we need to talk first about why, if you're the FSB, why, if you're Putin's creatures, Putin's operatives, why you would want an obscure Welsh politician in the European Parliament parroting your propaganda. What, I can imagine people sitting at home and thinking, well, kind of in the greater scheme of geopolitics, this isn't that big. Why would you even bother?
Yeah. So obviously, the first thing to say that Nathan Gill wasn't unique. Now, I'm not suggesting that other people were necessarily bribed by the Russians, but within European politics, there is, of course, on the radical right, a fairly consistently pro-Russian slant. In fact, again, no suggestion that Nigel Farage has taken money from Russia, but Farage himself in 2014 said of Vladimir Putin, he's the politician I most admire. There are plenty of connections between Russia and people who are around Farage. In August this year, according to his own disclosure of interests, the Reform MP Richard Tice was a guest at the French Riviera villa of one Vladimir Chernuchin, who is a former Russian deputy minister of finance. So that is just an indication of the sort of the degree to which there is this kind of sympathy and an openness to Russia that touches on what you were talking about earlier, Nick. So then, but if we think beyond Britain, there are politicians, the French Rally National, previously called the National Front, the Le Pen party, took a loan from the Russians. The Italian far right, not that of Giorgia Meloni, the current prime minister, but the other sort of
Liga.
party. Yeah, they also were in conversations with Russians about taking money. You've had Austrian politicians get caught up in a sting operation. There is a lot of this about now. Is this a sort of a chicken or an egg problem? Is it that the far right politicians are strangely attracted to the kind of socially conservative authoritarianism of Putin? Or is it, of course, that Putin sees an opportunity with unscrupulous politicians who might more easily be bought, someone like Nathan Gill, as you've described, who has financial concerns, who clearly sees himself as sitting outside a kind of, an establishment, NATO-centered view of the world, perhaps, when you're sitting there in Brussels, of course, with the NATO headquarters down the road. So I think there's a lot of vulnerability to it. So that's one point. But to come back to, why does it matter if one, North Wales MEP says something stupid in Brussels? I think that it's not just the significance of the individual speech, which I agree is fairly low. There's the point that it sits in this wider movement, this wider sense that, for example, if you take a very sort of right-wing view on homosexual rights, well, you can observe that, of course, Putin has a very homophobic series of policies, and Putin has aligned himself with the Russian Orthodox Church. So you've got that social conservative aspect. But then the other thing is actually the media empire that Putin is able to manipulate. We all know about Russia Today, which of course paid Nigel Farage to appear on the channel several times. Of course, now Farage, distances himself from that period, but that was something that was going on. And in a wider way, the Russians have become very good at inserting into the wider media narrative various sort of ideas, concepts that they might start off on fringe websites, obscure news portals that no one really watches, but eventually they will find their way into mainstream media, and that includes the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, Spectator, and eventually the BBC, because at a certain point, if something is being said enough, it becomes, a widespread part of the sort of conventional political narrative. So I think there is a lot of there's a lot of upside for Russia in cultivating what could be seen as relatively minor figures.
So, in the case of Nathan Gill, he's saying that Ukraine is a country, under attack,
Yeah,
is suppressing free journalism.
yeah,
This is the Russians. Then they've got their troll farms. They start pushing it on Twitter. They start pushing
exactly.
it on Telegram. And before you know it, JD Vance, in the case of another Russian lie, was pretty much saying that Zelensky's got a yacht on the basis of money
Yeah,
Americans have given him. And that is just straight Russian propaganda. But you do it enough, and you have enough people repeating it, and all the old cliches about the lies halfway around the world before the truth's got its boots on apply. So yeah, that makes sense. People, I think I need to come back to what you were saying about the reluctance of the British to investigate, because as you said, it's the FBI. They stop Voloshin at in airport in Washington D.C.
Yeah.
They go through his phone. They find all these mention of these payments, these presents, as Voloshin calls him, to Gill. They then contact anti-terrorist office in Britain who arrest him. Now, we used to say on The Observer after Brexit, we used to say two things. Um, we used to say, look, Brexit is so obviously in Vladimir Putin's interest. It is the biggest gift the British have ever given Russia. It weakens Britain. It weakens Britain financially. We've lost 4% of GDP. We're never going to
Yeah.
get that back again as long as we stay out. That means it's harder for us to pay for the armed forces, to pay for your foreign office, pay for intelligence services, pay for all the things Putin doesn't want us to pay for. It weakens us diplomatically. We're kind of isolated in the world now. I mean, I noticed so many Brits abroad who are saying no one even asked me about Britain anymore. We've kind of dropped
Yeah.
off the map. It weakens the EU economically. It's such a gift to Russia. But we then said, well, what are the security services meant to do? If suppose they found that there was Russian involvement in Brexit, like there was in the 2016 US election campaign when they hacked Hillary Clinton's emails, gave them to Assange, and helped him win, how on earth can they flag it up? They would have to go to Boris Johnson as Prime Minister and say, okay, Boris, you've got to realise this Brexit you championed, the Russians were all behind it and they were doing this and they were paying money there and they're running fake ads. How could they do that? I mean, presumably they would just have to say, oh God, we don't want to get involved in politics and run a mile.
Yeah. And in fact, I've had conversations with people in that world, and they use the rather sort of unsatisfactory term a hot potato. It's just a thing that no one wanted to get their hands on. As of course you'll recall, Nick, the Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, which exists to scrutinise the work of these agencies, had a Russia report fully analysed, read through, double-checked, all the rest of it, ready to publish. Boris Johnson sat on it for months and months. Eventually, when it came out, it didn't necessarily contain any bombshells, but what it did contain was the very clear point that there had never been an investigation of Russian attempts to interfere in the Brexit referendum. So, in fact, to the extent that we have arguably some of the best intelligence and security services in the world, they've never been asked what you might imagine is a rather important question. Of course, there is plenty of circumstantial evidence. Some brilliant journalists, including one of your Guardian Observer colleagues, Luke Harding, has.
Yeah, I was going to mention Luke's work later.
Yeah.
Because it's actually quite important. But yes,
Yeah.
please go on. Sorry, Arthur.
Well, I was going to, he did identify that Russian intelligence officers had meetings with pro-Brexit, figures across Westminster. Interestingly, more recently, something that came to light when there was the rather odd case of this little cell of Bulgarians who were working for the GRU. They were holed up in Great Yarmouth, I think, and plotting all kinds of dastardly stuff. And they look like a slightly sort of Keystone Cops crowd, not very serious. But people found images of them attending a parliamentary committee hearing on Brexit, I think 5 years ago. So this shows that there is, and then we all know about the long lunches between Aaron Banks and the Russian ambassador and Nigel Farage, also getting to know that man quite well. So again, no one's found evidence of money from the Russian state going.
There is no evidence of that, but there is a really weird cultural thing.
Yeah.
Of people who say they're patriots, who beat their chests, who wrap themselves in the Union Jack, who shag the flag, as the young people say these days, and denounce their opponents as not caring about Britain, being unpatriotic, at the same time are having lunch with the ambassadors representing our country's enemies. So that's one thing. There's a kind of world where weird bunch of Bulgarians, as you were saying, you say a bit odd, Keystone Copish, in Great Yarmouth of all places.
Mm,
Who would have thought of Great Yarmouth as a hotbed of international espionage? But there you go.
indeed.
They are working for the GRU, which I think we need to explain is the Russian intelligence services.
Yes.
They end up monitoring committee meetings on Brexit in the House of Commons.
Yeah. So
And
at one level, we think, again, people dismiss it and say, well, those guys were never serious, but they were serious enough to not just to sort of try and, sabotage and there was a sense that perhaps it was more of a kind of almost a vandalism project, but they were going to serious political meetings. They were clearly monitoring, what was at the time the most important political question in our country. And I think, this question about that going to lunch with a Russian ambassador, most politicians are extremely cautious about who they accept invitations from because, of course, it gives you a sense of where your values lie. And so the fact that it was by no means seen as problematic for these pro-Brexit.
well, let's go to reasons why it might not be
Yeah,
problematic. Actually, no. Before I do that, I want to really re-emphasize what you
yeah,
said because I think it's hugely important that people understand this. That after 2016, the security services said we can't investigate Russian
yeah,
interference because it's a hot potato, as your
yeah,
sources said, and your source is very good. And we're not having to rely on Arthur's sources here, ladies and gentlemen. The Russia report
yeah,
actually says this. So,
yeah,
because, I mean, there's an old ditty, treason never prospers. What's the reason? Because if it prospers, none dare call it treason. And none
yes,
dared, after 2016, say or investigate what Russia was up to in Britain, in around the Brexit referendum, because Brexit won and Brexit politicians, including quite manic people like Johnson, like Jacob Rees-Mogg, people who Dominic Cummings, people who are becoming, frankly, unhinged under the pressure of what they've done
mm,
because they've let loose the beast. They never thought they would win.
yeah,
They didn't think they would win, and then suddenly there's that famous image of the morning after the referendum result of Gove and Johnson standing there like people who've been found out, who
yeah,
they look terrified by what they've done,
yeah,
and so they're getting more and more manic. A part of them knows deep down that they've really let their country down. They've really acted against national interests, and they're not going to listen. And MI5 and MI6 know this. Everyone knows it. That if they go to them, they will be denounced as part of the blob or libtards or whatever, whatever insult
yeah,
is currently du jour in the comment pages of the Daily Telegraph. So treason has prospered. None dare call it treason. But can we just go back to what you said about why people like Gill, why people like Vance, like Le Pen, would find Putin so attractive? I mean, I'll put to you one reason is just staying with Brexit for a minute. Is in a mad way in the early 2010s, a large section of the right in Britain convinced themselves that Britain's enemy was the EU.
yeah.
You
No,
know,
absolutely.
it,
And even you get this sort of the extremists would talk about the EU as a kind of German Nazism revisited, which is clearly offensive and stupid. But even Boris Johnson would go on about it, and there was talk about how for Brexit was a form of national liberation. Again, to my mind, deeply offensive if you consider the number of countries that themselves had to be liberated from Soviet imperial control and then chose voluntarily to join the EU. The idea that the EU was some kind of, colonial imprisonment is quite mad. And again, you've got Ukrainians, as we speak, fighting and dying basically for the right to be able to join the EU, and yet Michael Gove said that we weren't an independent country until we'd left. So that's one of the ideas, that these people have become so obsessed with the EU that they honestly thought it was our number one enemy.
sorry, Arthur, just to
Yeah,
interrupt. And who agrees with on that? Vladimir Putin.
yeah,
He absolutely agree.
of course.
The EU is his enemy as well. So
Yeah, yeah, but then there is this weird thing, I think, of a sort of form of social conservatism, and ultimately Vladimir Putin is an extreme sort of totalitarian version of a populist politician. He portrays himself as a great nationalist. You know, he defends Russia. He likes strong families. He wants mothers to have lots of children, so they can send the boys off to die in Ukraine. But never mind. He's very anti same-sex relationships. He doesn't like Islam. Now, this is a really important one because Russia, of course, historically has a huge Muslim population, and Russia was traditionally a sort of atheist society in the Soviet period. Putin has gone back to this very, very strong embrace of the Russian Orthodox Church, which has become a kind of nationalist authoritarian buttress to his own ambitions. And this idea of there being a threat of radical Islam, quite a lot of people on the right, one of the reasons that they appreciate Putin is they see that he understands, as they would put it, the threat of sort of unchecked Islamification of our societies, which is, of course, a very kind of popular meme on the right, which aligns with ideas of the Great Replacement theory and so on. So I think that there's this sort of morass of ideas where someone like J.D. Vance or possibly Nigel Farage can look and sort of feel that if he was sitting having a quiet drink with Vladimir Putin, they'd find that they'd agree about quite a lot of things, whereas they feel viscerally that they disagree with a kind of modern European liberal sensibility on almost everything. And so you have this weird sense that Putin is actually our ally. But where this gets very, very confusing is, of course, then that particularly one of the really nasty features of the post-Brexit debate was people like us who were clearly Remainers, and we didn't stop being Remainers just because we'd lost that referendum. We were then accused of being traitors. Somehow we were the traitors to Britain because we didn't agree with this particular policy. Whereas these were the people that were embracing a country that has been nakedly undermining our national interest and, as you say, killing people on the streets of Britain for decades. So it's a very sort of muddled form of a kind of ideological alliance.
You are listening to The Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. Our guest is Arthur Snell, a Substack writer, podcast producer. He runs a very good podcast of his own, former Foreign Office diplomat. And we are talking about treason, modern treason, people on the radical right selling out this country to Putin's Russia. Arthur, it was very interesting what you said about the ideology, the propaganda of the Putin regime within Russia, that he's kind of returned to the ideology of the Tsars, in the late 19th, early 20th century, where I also remember a line of Christopher Hitchens: if fascism had been invented by Mussolini, had been invented by a Russian. It was very, very dark, imperial, mystic. Russia, Moscow is the third Rome after the fall of Rome, after the fall of Constantinople. We are the hope of the Christian world. And this is what is pumped out to Russian kids, to the poor guys who are fighting and dying in hideous numbers on the front. In the West, however, Russian propaganda is very different, because that wouldn't sell in the West. You wouldn't have very few people in the West would buy an argument about Russia's imperial destiny, about Russia's God-given right to dominate the world, to save Christianity. The closest you get to it are all these clowns who are allegedly realists or anything but, saying, oh, it's NATO's expansion drove Russia to it. But if you look at, when I watch shows like RT, I listen to pro-Putin politicians. What they are is very much like, actually, their line of attack is about liberal hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Your shit smells as bad as ours. How dare you criticize Russia when, your elections aren't representative, or you pay workers badly, or you do this, you do. And these charges actually were often, pretty good ones. They weren't always wrong, but it was a kind of derision of liberalism, which is what drives the radical right, a lot of the radical right. And anyone who's read my work, there's a lot to deride in modern liberalism. Progressives by no means have a monopoly of virtue or a monopoly of wisdom, far from it. But when you listen to the right, to a lot of the right, that's kind of all they have. You know,
Yeah.
they don't have a vision of a better society. They just have nostalgia, and then it's just aching desire, screaming obsessive desire to own the libs, and
Mm.
that's what Putin's propaganda gave them in the 2010s. I think, in any case.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think what's interesting is this, there's a kind of nihilism that's set in, which sadly I think has spread beyond the core constituency of the radical right into the kind of wider voting public that and you can see it in a way for the support for Keir Starmer since his election last year, which has, plummeted to very, very low levels. And obviously, I'm not saying that Starmer is perfect and therefore needs to have, support up at the level of sort of Winston Churchill or something. But it's quite interesting that I think a lot of people just simply don't believe anymore that politicians of any stripe have anything but their own sort of narrow self-interest to pursue. And what's weird about this, because you would think that if you're a politician, it's not on your interest sort of propagate this idea. But I think if you're a populist on the radical right, it is in your interest, because if you feed the cynicism of the population, then they won't punish you for lying to them. Um,
Yeah,
I'm very struck by the fact, that Nigel Farage recently has admitted that all of the massive tax cutting, proposals that he had at the last general election, on which he won millions of votes, he said they're just aspirational. And the way the media has responded is sort of said, well done, Nigel Farage, for proving that you're really realistic now, rather than saying, well, who the hell is this guy? Why should we consider him as our future prime minister when he's clearly, taken leave of any desire to tell us the truth? So it seems to me that feeding the nihilism of the public is a very effective way of undermining their faith in the idea that politics can create change. And then politics is purely about a kind of visceral response. So, we hate certain groups, so we will objectify them, or we will come up with ever harsher, treatments of for sake of argument, asylum seekers. And you don't really care whether this has been proved to work. Let us think back to the so-called Rwanda scheme, which everyone knew could have no impact whatsoever, but it had a sort of satisfying cruelty to it. So I think this that there is this that there's this sort of culture where populists by definition can't be measured on their actual sort of statistical achievements because they're usually very bad at governing. So it's much more important that they can be measured on the kind of sense of, as you say, a kind of dark, almost mystical approach, where we stop believing that our societies can actually tackle any problems at all.
yeah. There's a line from Hannah Arendt. I mean, I guess people can look it up. It's that on totalitarianism, she says it's what totalitarian leaders want is not necessarily for you to believe in anything.
Yeah.
It is for you to believe in nothing. They want you to think
Yes.
everything's a lie. Because, in a strange way, because I come from a newspaper culture where you're investigative journalists, you hold power to account, you expose the politicians.
Yeah.
But and we thought that would make a better society. And I still, obviously do believe that in a way. But a paradoxical consequence of that can be they're all liars, they're all corrupt, therefore we will accept our strongman, our Berlusconi, our Trump,
Yeah.
our Orban, our Putin, even though we know he's got our Farage,
Mm.
even though we know he lies, as Farage has, well, he frankly lied about Brexit. They all lied about Brexit.
Mm.
Because they all do it. So we don't even care about that anymore. But he's a liar on our side.
Yeah.
So we will defend him. A paradoxical way, the kind of post-Watergate journalistic culture has led to not a better and more open society, but to more dictatorial figures taking power because they got so obsessed by every minor mistake a politician made. You only go back to the 90s with Jeremy Paxman and everyone thinking, well,
Mm.
isn't it marvellous? He asked Michael Howard the same question about prisons 6 times. Who gives a fuck? Honestly. I mean, he's meant to be a journalist. He's meant to go out and find out what's happening in the prisons, not
Yeah.
sit there
Not just
haranguing
ask the same person.
Michael
Yeah.
Howard. Um, uh, has ended up by boosting strongmen who say they're all liars. I'm a bigger liar. I'm more corrupt, but I am your guy. I
Yeah.
lie for you.
Yeah.
And that again, Putin encouraged that. Putin senses that. He can see that he might be a terrible military leader, uh, but he's very good at reading the darkness in people's souls.
Definitely. Yeah. So, his psychological manipulation, particularly of Donald Trump, but of others, has been stunning, even as his invasion of Ukraine has clearly been a disaster.
Do you still? Last time we had you on,
Mm.
you and your colleague Christopher Steele, I should say, you've worked together, uh, were saying with considerable justice, there's a ton of evidence that Trump, well, certainly that Putin worked for Trump to get Trump elected. That should be beyond any doubt. I mean, it is
Mm.
beyond any doubt. They hacked Hillary Clinton's emails. They gave him to Julian Assange. They helped turn the election. Russians were working to turn key institutions like the National Rifle Association in the States. On that case, do you still think there is a reasonable case for saying that Putin has enough on Trump to keep him on board, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a good question because obviously Trump has, shall we say, diverted from the path slightly. He is now supporting sanctions, much harsher sanctions on Russia. I think what you have with Trump is somebody who clearly absolutely hates to look weak. He can't. That's one of his main sort of offers to the American public is that he projects strength and a kind of indifference to those that dislike him. And Putin had started to make him look weak, and particularly, I think, in the run up to the planned but then cancelled summit in Hungary, it was pretty clear that Trump was going to go and fly and meet Putin and then be told, well, sorry, not interested. I'm not going to make any concessions at all when it comes to Ukraine. And so Trump, I imagine, started to feel embarrassed, and people on his own side were probably saying this doesn't look good. Now, does that fundamentally change the sort of way that Trump looks at Russia and looks at Ukraine and how he feels about it? I don't think it does. And I think what's interesting did Trump then give Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, which was being talked about? No, he didn't. Did Trump very publicly assert that there wasn't going to be a peace deal that allowed Russia to take control of the Donbass? No. So what you've got is this weird situation where I think Trump realizes that he's been made to look stupid by Putin, but he can't bring himself to do what anyone who wasn't, in some way exposed, which would be to say, well, these people are clearly the aggressors. These people clearly, the Ukrainians clearly need our support. We need to maximize the pressure on Russia. So they're just trying to do a bit of everything now. Of course, the other thing with Trump is that he loses focus. He gets interested in a new thing. So I wonder whether we might see a revival of this idea of a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, with Trump as the sort of bridesmaid, because then he will then start to sort of rediscover his belief that he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. And then inevitably Trump will then return to the very, very kind of pro-Russian approach that he was taking earlier this year.
You're listening to The Lowdown with me, Nick Cohen. My guest this week is Arthur Snell, podcaster, journalist, writer, and former Foreign Office diplomat. Arthur, can we just take one last thing? We've got the Nathan Gill trial. He's being sentenced on the 21st November. His lawyers said he's expecting a custodial sentence, which would be quite tough, considering I can't think of a parallel to this case. He's not being charged with espionage or treason. There's no kind of treason charge to charge him with. He's being charged with accepting bribes. So we'll see what the judge says and the judge's reasoning on all of that. Do you think this is the first of many cases? Do you think it's impossible to know, but we no longer have Brexiteers in charge of the government? We presumably now have intelligence services who are alert to Russian interference in our democracy and are not frightened of a Boris Johnson or a Jacob Rees-Mogg throwing their toys out of the pram if they're told the truth. Do you think we're going to see more of this?
I'm afraid to say I don't think we are. I hope I'm proved wrong, but the reason I don't think that is that it seems to me that, for a start, the current government, they may not be Brexiteers, but they're certainly insisting in ways that lots of people find incomprehensible that they have to sort of cling to pretty much the letter of a very hard Brexit deal. Yes, there are tweaks around the edges, and of course, hopefully those might continue. But we have the weird spectre of Rachel Reeves stating the obvious, which is that Brexit is one of the main causes of the lack of growth in the UK economy, whilst ruling out any sort of structural approach, such as perhaps joining a customs union, which of course would not affect migration policy, would not affect the EU's ability to legislate in the UK Parliament. But anyway, they're still ruling that out, let alone something more ambitious like the single market. So I think there's a lot of fear of the Brexit issue, and the way Labour Party seems to behave is that it assumes that its core vote is an aging Brexit voting, retired former manual labourer in a sort of unionised profession. Whereas I genuinely don't think if you sort of analyse who voted Labour at the last election, that is the core voter. But anyway, so they seem to sort of they behave in that way. And I think there's also, even on behalf of, the institutions such as police, security services, and so on, I think there's a real desire not to get dragged back into that. To some extent, the war in Ukraine sort of gave a clean slate. It certainly gave Boris Johnson a clean slate because he had obviously all kinds of exposure to Russia, his friendship with with the former KGB officer whose son he then put in the House of Lords. I'm talking, of course, about the Lebedev family.
Whose son put in the House of Lords almost mocked this country by calling himself Lord Lebedev of Siberia.
Yeah. I mean,
Fuck
yes,
off.
who could imagine that
I mean, fuck off, honestly.
a conservative prime minister has ennobled Lord Siberia from the KGB dynasty? But there we go. But then you see Boris Johnson, by doing the right thing on Ukraine, probably for, short-term political expediency, but it doesn't matter. He did the right thing. Allowed to sort of slightly wipe his own pro-Russian slate clean. So I think there's a desire from a lot of people to move on. We want to move on from Brexit, move on from that period when Londongrad was a thing, and pretend none of it ever happened.
Yeah, well, we can't move on. We can't move on from Brexit because it's a bleeding wound and
Yeah,
nothing can stem it until we rejoin the single market. And we can't move on from Londongrad because Russia is still targeting us. I mean,
yeah,
what is so bizarre about all of this, from all your conversations about people not wanting hot potatoes, turning a blind eye, is Putin, the FSB, Russia isn't saying, "Oh, leave Britain alone." They're constantly, as you say, they're sending saboteurs, they're paying
yeah.
saboteurs into the country. Propaganda is flooding the country. Um, they've got people in Britain. I'm not saying they've been bribed. Although I want to make this point, Arthur. There was a really, really interesting case in America, staggering case.
Hmm.
There were a group of American journalists. Journalists is the wrong word. Influencers,
Yeah.
YouTube, Twitter,
Hmm.
uh, people, very right wing. One of them is an absolute scoundrel called Dave Rubin. Now I remember this character because he was emerging in the second half of the 2010s, and was doing well on YouTube, well on Twitter, and you can make a lot of money out of it.
Hmm.
And he wanted me on because I wrote a book called What's Left about how it was that people who called themselves left wing, called themselves socialists, ended up supporting Islamist movements, which if they were white or Christian, they would have no
Yeah.
hesitation at all in describing as far right wing. They were against women's rights, they were against gay rights, the drill. And he had me on, and I said, and he of course he loved that because he's a right wing. And I said, but look, Dave, you've got to look at this character Trump who's coming up. It was
Hmm.
2015, 2016. Look at this character Trump who's coming up. He is just as much a threat to civil liberties as anyone
Yeah.
on the left. And Rubin said, "Oh yeah, I'm as willing. You're a left winger, Nick. You're willing to call out your side when they're in the wrong. I'm absolutely willing to call out Trump. If he starts messing about with our basic freedoms, I will be there on the front line." Like hell he was.
Yeah.
As soon as Trump won, he thought that's where the money was, that's where the audience was. He went with it. Anyway, Rubin and other people in America are producing pro-Russian narratives, pro-Russian propaganda off their own bat.
Yeah.
off their own back. They're just doing it because that's what a section, not all of the MAGA base, incidentally, the large part of the Republican Party is still pro-Ukraine, but there is that whole Tucker Carlson world where there's
Yeah.
money in that, and they were doing it off their own back, and Russia set up through a kind of media company, a media
Mm.
front company, a means of paying them, of giving them money for doing, virtually no work at all and paying them huge
Yeah.
fees to keep them going because they were coming out with pro-Russian propaganda. Now, when this scandal broke, which is incidentally happened under the Biden administration, Trump, to back up what you were saying, Trump has closed down all these investigations, just as I don't imagine pro-Ukrainian oligarchs to be arrested by the FBI anymore when they're
Nope.
going through Washington Dulles Airport. When the scandal broke under the Biden administration, Rubin and all these people said, but we genuinely didn't know it was Russia. And you know what? They might have been telling the truth because they were doing it all anyway. But Russia was still spotting that and still making sure, well,
Yeah.
whatever happens, we want Rubin to keep coming out with all this shit because we want this propagated. Let's get some money to him to make sure he's okay. So anyone you hear, the point of this is anyone you hear on the radio, on Twitter, anywhere, left or right, giving pro-Putin propaganda, there is money there for them. It's reasonable to
Yeah.
say either they're being bribed or if they're not, there is money on the table. There is money on the table for them to take because Russia is so keen on pumping up people who support its interests. It will even give money to people who don't ask for it.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. And I think, you know, there are huge questions about, for example, funding of Brexit campaigns, which have never been answered, never been answered. We don't know enough, for example, about the way, British politics is fairly easy for dark money to find its way in. We know very little about the way Reform UK is funded, partly because it's run as a private company owned by Nigel Farage, which again is, that was sort of faintly interesting when it was a minority activity. It might be the government of our country in a couple of years' time. This is a really serious issue. And as noted earlier in this conversation, Russians have funded other radical right movements across Europe. I'm not saying they've funded Reform UK, but it seems to me that that's something which it would be good to know more about what these
Well,
sources of the funding are.
Well, and I'm sure Nigel Farage will be the first to agree with this. It would be good to have institutions that make that impossible.
Mm,
Just so any cloud of suspicion could be lifted and sweetness and
indeed.
light prevail. On that note, I'm afraid we must leave it. I need to thank Arthur Snell very much for coming on and for absolutely disturbing but brilliant dissection of where the radical right and Russia stand today. Arthur, you have your own Substack and your own podcast. Can you tell listeners
Yes.
where they can find it?
Yes, so the Substack, you search by my name or by the name of the newsletter, Not All Doom, which I'm afraid to say, as Nick has rightly identified earlier, is a missell because there's quite a lot of doom around. But never mind, I still try to show a bit of light here and there. And then my podcast is called Behind the Lines, and again, you can find that wherever you find podcasts.
Okay, if you like my writing, you can find my Substack, Nick Cohen, writing from London. Just Google Nick Cohen, just Google Nick Cohen, or go Nick Cohen, writing from London. If you like this podcast, please, please, please give us a nice review, give us 5 stars. It helps push us up the league tables. There are league tables of podcasts. How bizarre. But that is a modern world for you, ladies and gentlemen. The producer we need to thank is Andrew Hoskin. My name is Nick Cohen. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time, goodbye.